late 1870, Wyoming Territory. The vast, unforgiving wilderness stretched before Claire Madsen like an endless sea of white, the snow endless and cruel. The wind howled through the trees, a fierce and biting force that left no mercy for anyone in its path. The cold was biting, enough to make even the strongest tremble. But it was the bitter reminder of survival in the West, how quickly nature could take what it wanted. And it was here, beneath the shadow of the Grand Teton, in an abandoned stage stop where a life or death story was unfolding. The stage stop had once been a bustling hub of activity. Travelers came and went, stories told by firelight. But now, it was a forgotten relic, with broken doors, shattered windows, and the remnants of violence echoing in the walls. The lanterns inside had been smashed, their glass shattered and scattered on the floor. The smell of burnt oil, smoke, and something metallic hung heavy in the air. Blood, old and fresh, soaked into the wooden floorboards, a stark contrast to the white purity of the snow outside. Claire's boots made the only noise in the wreckage, crunching against the broken glass as she stumbled forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Every step was deliberate, every movement calculated. Her mind was clouded with panic, but she could not afford to show it. The wind outside was a constant reminder that the world wasn't kind, and in the wilderness, it didn't take long for death to come knocking. The child. It was always about the child now. She had made a promise to a dying woman, one that had weighed her down with responsibility. The baby, still swaddled tightly in the woman's arms, was now Claire's responsibility. She hadn't asked for it, but the moment she took the child, everything changed. Outside, the wind howled again, as if the world itself was warning her. The men were coming. Claire could hear their voices through the walls, muffled but distinct. "Find her! She's hiding in there!" The words were sharp, fueled by rage. They were after the ledger, the one that held too many secrets, too much power, and they would kill anyone to get it. Claire knew they were closing in. The night was dark, and the stage stop had nothing left to offer but cold stone walls. She had to move, had to get out before they reached her. She glanced down at the child once more. The baby was quiet, its tiny face peering out from a bundle of thick fabric, its small chest rising and falling with each breath. Claire swallowed hard and nodded to herself. She would protect him, no one else would. Her hands tightened around the baby, and as the wind howled louder outside, Claire moved, desperate to escape, knowing that the clock was ticking and that she was already running out of time. The desperate struggle, the chill of the night seeped into Claire's bones as she dashed through the snow. Her breath came out in shallow, ragged gasps, fogging the cold air as she staggered through the snowstorm. Each step felt like it could be her last. The baby was bundled tightly against her chest, its soft whimpers cutting through the stillness of the wilderness. Behind her, the sound of footsteps grew louder, boots thudding against the snow. Claire's heart raced as she glanced over her shoulder. The men were gaining on her, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. "Don't let her get away. She's got the ledger," one of the voices shouted, hoarse and filled with rage. The words sent a cold shiver down her spine. The ledger, a book of secrets that would cost them everything, had become her burden. But for her, it was about the baby. Her legs burned with each step. Her body was already exhausted from the run, and the cold was beginning to seep in, numbing her fingers and making it harder to keep her footing. The snow piled higher with each gust of wind, making it harder to move. Her body was covered in bruises, and her side ached from a bullet, graze. But she couldn't stop. Not now. The trees around her were thick with snow, their branches creaking under the weight. Claire's teeth chattered as she ducked beneath one, pushing forward. Her eyes scanned the snow-covered landscape for any sign of shelter, any sign of safety, but there was nothing. Just endless snow, thick and suffocating, wrapping around her like a trap. The baby's soft whimpers continued in her arms, and Claire's resolve only grew stronger. They wouldn't catch her. They couldn't. She wasn't going to let them take him. Suddenly, the snow under her feet gave way, and she slipped, falling hard into a snowbank. Pain shot through her injured shoulder, but she bit her lip to stifle a cry. She had no time to waste. The men were getting closer, and she could feel the blood, the cold, the fear creeping in. With one last burst of strength, Claire pushed herself up, wincing as she straightened. Her vision blurred, and her legs trembled beneath her, but she took a deep breath, then moved forward once more. The baby was still with her, still safe. That was all that mattered. The wind howled as she pushed forward, stumbling through the snow, the darkness swallowing her whole. And still, behind her, the men came closer. Claire's harrowing flight. Claire could feel the sting of the cold biting at her skin, but it was nothing compared to the burning in her chest. Her lungs screamed for air as she stumbled through the thick snow, the weight of the baby pulling her down with every step. The infant's whimpers had grown louder, and Claire clutched the child tighter to her chest, her heart racing. The forest around her was dark and oppressive, the trees looming like silent sentinels in the night. Her body felt as though it was made of stone, frozen, aching, heavy. The cold had seeped into her bones, numbing her legs, making it nearly impossible to keep moving. Every step felt like an eternity, and yet she couldn't stop. The baby needed her. She had promised that she would protect him, and there was no turning back now. Her breath came in ragged bursts, and her injured side throbbed painfully with each movement, but she couldn't slow down. The men were closing in. She could hear their shouts, their horses' hooves crunching against the snow as they drew closer. She had to make it to the ridge, to the place where the snow would be softer, where she might be able to lose their trail. But even as she pushed forward, the exhaustion and pain seemed to swallow her whole. Her vision blurred, and she stumbled once again, nearly falling. She gripped the baby tighter, fighting against the growing wave of panic that threatened to consume her. The baby's cries cut through the wind, and she gritted her teeth. "Shh, it's okay," she whispered, her voice breaking as she fought back the tears. "I've got you. I won't let them take you." The world around her seemed to spin, and she fell again, this time landing face first, into the snow. Her arms gave out, and she lay there for a moment, the cold biting into her skin as she fought to catch her breath. She could hear the voices of the men, growing louder now. They were getting close, too close. But then, through the wind and the snow, she heard something else. The sound of hooves, faint but distinct. She turned her head, her breath catching in her throat. Had they caught up to her? The sound grew louder, and for a moment, Claire's heart skipped a beat. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the sound disappeared. It was replaced by the snap of a branch in the distance. Claire's eyes widened in panic. They were here. Colt Avery's discovery. Colt Avery had spent most of his life in these woods tracking game, riding through the harsh, unforgiving terrain. He knew the land like the back of his hand, every ridge, every tree, every turn. But today, something was different. The air felt heavier, and the snow, though beautiful, seemed almost ominous. He'd been tracking elk all day, but a strange, erratic trail of blood had caught his attention. It wasn't from any animal he knew. This was something else entirely. He dismounted from his mare, crouching low to inspect the tracks. His pulse quickened as he followed the trail, which grew thicker with each step. Something was wrong. Whoever had left these marks wasn't just injured, they were in desperate trouble. Colt's instincts told him that whoever it was, they weren't far ahead. He moved faster now, following the trail deeper into the woods, his eyes scanning the landscape. And then, as he rounded a bend in the trees, he saw it. A body. Claire Madsen, lying half buried in the snow, her face pale and frozen. The baby, still cradled tightly in her arms, was alive, its tiny chest rising and falling with each fragile breath. Colt's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea who this woman was, but one thing was clear. She had been through hell, and the baby had been with her every step of the way. He knelt beside her, checking for any signs of life. Her pulse was faint, but there. The baby was alive, though freezing and covered in snow. Colt's mind raced. The storm had passed, but the danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He quickly scooped up the baby, wrapping it carefully in his coat to keep it warm. Claire's life hung in the balance, but the baby needed immediate care too. Colt glanced down at the woman, her breath shallow but still there. He had to move. The careful rescue, Colt Avery didn't hesitate. His heart raced as he cradled the baby tightly in his arms, tucking the tiny body into his thick coat for warmth. The snow around them was a harsh reminder of how quickly the world could turn cold, how quickly survival could become a fight between life and death. The baby, despite being swaddled in layers of fabric, was still too cold, its little hands stiff and trembling. But the warmth of Colt's chest and the quick action were enough to revive the child's fragile breathing, if only just. Claire lay unconscious, her body limp, her skin pale, and her lips tinged with blue from the cold. Colt's pulse quickened as he looked at her, checking her wounds again. The blood on her torn clothes was enough to tell him that she was badly hurt. The danger was real, but the survival instincts he had honed over a lifetime as a cowboy kicked in. He moved with practiced precision, wrapping Claire carefully in his saddle blanket, lifting her as gently as possible without jarring her already injured body. She was limp, almost lifeless, but he could feel the faint beat of her heart as he placed her on the back of his horse. His fingers grazed her shoulder, where blood had soaked through her clothes, and his chest tightened. He knew the severity of her condition. She didn't have much time. He had to get her somewhere safe, somewhere he could tend to her wounds. The baby was still in his arms, now tucked securely beneath his vest, its tiny body shivering despite the warmth he offered. Colt didn't care about the cold air biting at his face or the weight of Claire in his arms. All that mattered was getting them both to safety. He glanced up at the sky, where the gray clouds had begun to break, revealing a pale moon that hung in the sky like a ghostly witness to the desperate events unfolding beneath it. Without a second thought, Colt guided his mare through the snow, careful to avoid the deeper drifts that might slow them down. His mind raced as he calculated the distance back to his cabin. It was a rough ride, but it was the only option. The wilderness was treacherous, and the cold was relentless, but he wasn't going to lose her, not when he had the chance to help her. As he rode, his thoughts turned to the baby. It was no ordinary child. Something about the baby's presence seemed to alter the weight of the world on his shoulders. The urgency to keep the baby safe fueled Colt's every movement. He had no idea who the child was, or why the woman had been so determined to protect it, but he knew that whatever it was important. The ledger, hidden in the child's clothing, it had to be more than just a simple book, and if it meant protecting the baby, Colt would see that through to the end, no matter what the cost. The ride back to his cabin felt longer than it ever had before. Every minute stretched into eternity as the wind whipped through the trees, making the journey even more perilous. But Colt didn't let up. He couldn't afford to. Every mile was one step closer to safety for Claire and the baby. A bond begins. By the time they reached Colt's cabin, the storm had passed, but the aftermath lingered in the form of heavy snow and silence. The world outside had been swallowed by the storm, and the landscape felt like something from a dream. A place where time stood still, where nothing could survive except those strong enough to endure. Colt dismounted slowly, his legs sore from the long ride, and lifted Claire from the horse. He was gentle, careful with her fragile form, not wanting to cause her any more pain than she had already endured. The baby remained tucked inside his coat, now still, but warm. Colt moved swiftly, cradling Claire in his arms as he stepped into the cabin. The warmth inside, a stark contrast to the bitter cold outside. He laid Claire on the furs near the fire, her body a dead weight against him, and immediately turned to the baby, checking it over once more to ensure it was warm enough. The child's soft, even breathing reassured him, but Claire's condition had him worried. The blood that soaked through her clothes was a reminder of the peril she had faced. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a soft glow across the room. Colt stoked the flames, making the cabin as warm as possible before turning his attention back to Claire. She was pale, her body stiff with cold, and her breath shallow. He knew she wasn't out of danger yet, but he also knew that he had to stay calm. As the hours passed, Colt carefully tended to the baby, keeping it close and warm by the fire. The little one had stopped crying and seemed to have settled, but Claire remained unconscious, her face drawn in pain. Colt's thoughts wandered as he worked, his hands deftly preparing the cabin for their stay, but his mind couldn't stop replaying the events of the night. Who was this woman? What had driven her to sacrifice so much for this baby? The night wore on, and the wind outside howled louder, but inside, a different kind of silence filled the room. The fire flickered low, casting long shadows across the cabin. Colt sat quietly beside Claire, watching her, willing her to wake up. There was something about her, a strength that he couldn't quite explain. An unlikely protector. Claire's eyes fluttered open sometime during the night, but she didn't stir immediately. Her gaze moved slowly around the room, taking in the dim light, the crackling fire, and the warmth of the cabin. She seemed disoriented at first, but then her eyes fixed on the baby, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. "Where is he?" Claire rasped, her voice hoarse from fever and exhaustion. She tried to sit up, but Colt was quick to stop her. "He's safe," Colt said, his voice calm and steady, reassuring in its certainty. "I've got him." Claire's eyes locked onto the baby, now nestled in a makeshift cradle near the fire. Her breath caught in her throat, a flood of relief washing over her. The baby was alive. It was safe. She could barely believe it, but the child's steady breathing was proof enough. Her shoulders sagged with the weight of her relief, but as the moments passed, Claire's anxiety returned. Her gaze shifted to the door, then to Colt. "The men, they'll come after us," she said, her voice shaking now. "They won't stop, they'll kill us. They won't find us," Colt reassured her. "I'll make sure of it." Claire's heart raced as she looked into Colt's eyes, unsure whether to believe him. She didn't know who he was, why he had risked his life to save her and the baby, but for some reason, she felt like she could trust him. Something in his demeanor told her he wouldn't let them fall into the hands of the men who had chased her so far. She leaned back, exhausted, her body still trembling from the cold, the fever, and the fear. The baby stirred again in the cradle, and Claire's gaze shifted toward it. She felt a deep connection to the child, as if they were linked by something more than survival. She had fought for the baby, not for any gain of her own, but because it was the right thing to do. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The words felt small compared to the depth of her gratitude, but it was all she could offer. Colt didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood up, went to the fire, and stoked it higher. The warmth of the room was soothing, but it wasn't enough to fully comfort Claire. She still felt the weight of what was coming. The men who had hunted her down, the ledger that could ruin them all, it was all too much to bear. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she allowed herself to relax. She wasn't alone anymore. She was safe, for now, and that had to be enough. Reeve Maddox's passed outside the cabin. The world was silent, but danger still loomed. Reeve Maddox was not the type of man to be easily deterred. He had a reputation, one built on violence, manipulation, and cold-blooded calculation. Maddox's thirst for power had cost many lives, but now, with the ledger in Claire's hands, he was desperate to reclaim what was his. The ledger wasn't just a list of names and dates. It was a blueprint for future power, an edge that could tip the balance in his favor, and Claire had taken it from him. For that, she and anyone involved would pay the price. Maddox sent his men out into St. John's Side, the wilderness, searching for any sign of Claire, but they were met with no success. The storm had obscured all trails, and the land itself seemed to be working against them. But Maddox wouldn't give up so easily. He knew what Claire had, and he knew that with that ledger, everything he wanted was within reach. What he didn't know, though, was that Colt Avery was not a man to be underestimated. Colt had already faced down the worst the West had to offer: bandits, bounty hunters, and ruthless outlaws, but protecting Claire and the baby was unlike any fight he had ever fought before. Maddox had no idea what kind of fight was coming his way. Colt wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting to protect the lives of those who depended on him. The final stand. The days that followed were tense. Despite the warmth of the cabin, the cold, unrelenting danger outside never seemed to fade. The wind still howled through the trees. The storm still lingered in the air, even though the skies had cleared. In the distance, the shadow of the men who had hunted them stretched across the land, waiting for their chance to strike. Claire lay in the cabin, resting but never truly at ease. The baby slept peacefully in the corner, swaddled in blankets, warm from the fire that crackled in the hearth. But the tension in the cabin was palpable. Every noise, every creak of the floorboards made them jump. Every crack of the fire, every gust of wind had them wondering, are they here? Colt didn't allow himself to relax. He moved about the cabin in quiet determination, his eyes ever watchful, his mind constantly calculating. He had already made up his mind he would protect Claire and the baby at all costs. He wasn't just some cowboy who had wandered into a rescue mission. He wasn't just a stranger helping out of some misplaced sense of duty. No, this was personal. His instincts had told him something was wrong the moment he found Claire, and since then, he'd felt a sense of responsibility that ran deeper than just the moment. It was a bond, forged through shared danger, a bond he wouldn't break. As night fell, the distant sound of hooves reached Colt's ears. His heart skipped. The men, they were closing in. But this time, he wasn't just going to run or hide. He would make his stand. Claire, still recovering from her injuries and fever, heard the sounds too. She knew what it meant, and her heart pounded in her chest. They were here. They were coming for her, for the baby. But this time, it was different. This time, they weren't just running. They were fighting back. "Colt," she whispered, her voice hoarse but determined. "They won't stop until they have him." Her eyes locked onto the baby in the corner, her face a mask of exhaustion but also defiance. "I won't let them take him." Colt walked over to her, his face calm, his eyes steady. "They won't get him, not while I'm standing between them and you." His voice was unwavering, filled with a quiet strength that Claire hadn't realized she needed until now. "I'll protect him. I'll protect both of you." The words were simple, but they carried a weight far beyond the cabin walls. There was no bravado in his tone, no false promises. He wasn't speaking out of arrogance. He was speaking from a place of truth. Colt Avery was a man of action, not words, and his actions spoke louder than anything he could say. Colt gathered his rifle and moved to the door, carefully checking the windows. The cabin wasn't much: wooden walls, a tin roof, and a small hearth, but it was all they had. It wasn't a fortress, but it would have to do. Outside, the moonlight reflected off the snow, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. The men had arrived. Claire's heart raced as she listened to the sounds outside, the clattering of hooves, the creak of leather, the gruff voices of the men who were about to enter her world once more. And then, they arrived. The door to the cabin swung open, and a group of rough men stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room. They were armed, their faces hardened by the harshness of the frontier. They had come for the ledger, and they would stop at nothing to get it. But when they saw Colt standing by the door, rifle in hand, their expressions faltered. "Where's the woman?" one of the men growled, his hand twitching toward the holster at his side. Colt didn't flinch. His eyes never left the man's face. "She's not going anywhere," he said quietly. "And neither is the baby." The tension in the room grew thick. Colt's finger was on the trigger, his gaze sharp. He wasn't going to let anyone get past him. Not today. Not ever. The leader of the group, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, stepped forward, sneering. "You think you can stop us? You're just a cowboy." He laughed darkly. "We've got more men. You're outnumbered." Colt's eyes narrowed. "You're welcome to try." The room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Claire's heart was in her throat as she watched the standoff unfold. She didn't know how this would end, but she knew that this man, this cowboy, was the only thing standing between her, her baby, and the men who wanted them dead. In the tense moments that followed, the sound of Colt's calm breathing was the only thing that kept her grounded. Finally, the leader of the group nodded to his men. "Take him out." The moment the words left his mouth, Colt fired. The shot rang out, and the man at the front of the group fell, his body crumpling to the floor. The others scattered, pulling their guns and taking cover behind the furniture. Claire gasped, instinctively grabbing the baby to her chest. The fight had started, and she wasn't sure how it would end, but she knew Colt was determined to see it through. Gunshots erupted, the sound deafening in the small cabin. Colt moved with precision, his rifle steady in his hands. He fired again, and another man fell. The remaining men hesitated, clearly outmatched. The tension was palpable. The men were closing in, but Colt wasn't done yet. He fired once more, the bullet hitting its mark. The last man fell, his gun skittering across the floor. Colt stood tall, rifle in hand, scanning the room for any remaining threats. Claire's heart was still pounding in her chest, but she knew that, for now, they were safe. The men who had come for them were no more, but the danger wasn't over, not by a long shot. The new beginning. The next few days were a blur of exhaustion, relief, and healing. Colt stayed by Claire's side, tending to her wounds, making sure she and the baby were safe. They couldn't leave just yet. There were still some things that needed to be done. As the days turned into weeks, the harshness of the Wyoming winter began to ease, and with it, the weight of their survival. They had come through the storm. They had faced the worst and emerged on the other side stronger. Spring slowly crept into the landscape, bringing with it a sense of renewal. The snow began to melt, and new life started to stir beneath the earth. The once bleak, barren land was now alive with the promise of growth. Claire stood outside the cabin one morning, her hand on the baby's back as he toddled across the yard. The sight of him, so small and innocent, filled her with a deep sense of gratitude. She had fought for him, and in doing so, she had found a new purpose in life. The world had tried to take everything from her, but she had fought back, and now she had something to protect: a family, not of blood, but of love. Colt watched from a distance, his face softening as he looked at the child. The rough cowboy who had once lived only for survival now found himself wrapped in something unexpected: hope. A new chapter was unfolding before him, one he hadn't expected but was beginning to cherish. Claire smiled at Colt, a quiet understanding passing between them. Words weren't necessary. They both knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they weren't facing it alone. The baby giggled and fell, but Colt was there in an instant, lifting him up with a grin. He glanced over at Claire, his expression tender. There was no need for more words. The bond between them had been forged in fire, in snow, and in the silent promises of survival. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the world felt peaceful, still, and full of possibility. The past was behind them, and a future full of hope awaited.